But suppose a crime had no witnesses, no crime scene, and no trace of a body. In April 1992, a 13-year-old Chevette was towed into an impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. There, it joined the ranks of other abandoned vehicles, awaiting their date with the crusher. At the time, no one knew it, but this car held a terrible secret.
Got it. Go, John.
Everyone in New Albany, Indiana, knew that Eric Humbert and Jonathan Whitesides were the best of friends.
I'll follow you over there. All right, man. Hey, next game.
They worked together in the U.S. Geological Survey, and they played together after work and on the weekends. So it only seemed fitting that John Whitesides was the last person to see Eric Humbert alive. On the evening of January 15, 1991, after a game of hoops with their co-workers, the two drove to the auto shop to drop Whiteside's truck off for repairs before heading home. But by 9:30 that night, Humbert still hadn't arrived at his house. Eric's wife, Missy, said she phoned Whitesides to see if he'd seen him. Whitesides told her Eric had left just a few minutes ago and assured her he'd be arriving home any minute. But the minutes turned to hours. At 2 a.m., Missy called Whitesides again. Eric still wasn't home, and she was worried. Jonathan said he'd be right over. Eric never returned. Though Missy had spoken to the police the day after Eric disappeared, she didn't file an official missing persons report until 2 weeks later. Their relationship was becoming strained, and she thought Eric may just have wanted a little time by himself. But now she felt something terrible had happened. Eric was gone too long. He wouldn't have left his 18-month-old son. That wasn't like him. Detective Keith Whitlow of the New Albany Police led the investigation.
We began interviewing co-workers. There was rumors that Eric may have had a girlfriend in another state. We checked with that person, and she hadn't seen Eric. So his disappearance was pretty mysterious to everyone. Not only was he gone, but also was his automobile. There was without a trace.
But something of interest did come from interviewing Missy's co-workers. Suspicions centered around Jonathan Whitesides, but there was not the slightest evidence that anything illegal had happened, nothing to link him to any wrongdoing. The two may have been guilty of indiscretion, but there's no law against that. Months went by. It seemed the earth had swallowed up Eric Humbert and his car. Meanwhile, Whitesides moved in with Missy and her son. Then, in April, 4 months after Eric was reported missing, a white Chevette turned up in a state impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. Unclaimed, it was about to be sold or scrapped.
But they decided, as a matter of routine, to make one last check with the National Crime Information Center to see if this car was in fact stolen and whether they could have located an owner. When they did, they got a hit on the car showing that the car was part of a missing persons investigation right across the Ohio River from them in New Albany, Indiana. We were very, very close to losing a very key piece of the puzzle.
The car belonged to Eric Humbert. It was stripped of its tags. In the hatchback were traces of blood. Louisville detectives interviewed Whitesides, the last person to see Humbert alive.
Do you know who killed Eric Humbert?
No.
He consented to a polygraph exam.
Do you know where Eric Humbert is?
No.
He failed.
Did you kill Eric Humbert?
No.
When confronted with the results, Whitesides admitted he knew more than he let on. He told police that after the basketball game on the night Eric disappeared, the two men drove to the auto shop to drop off Whiteside's truck. Afterward, they drove to Whiteside's house to work on another car. From there, Whiteside's story took a bizarre twist.
He says that suddenly Eric went into a rage and accused him of having an affair with his wife and produced a knife, and that an altercation, a physical altercation between the two men developed there in the garage. During the scuffle, Jonathan claimed that Eric was accidentally stabbed in the throat, a wound which, according to Jonathan, proved to be fatal.
Jonathan panicked. He thought nobody would believe the freak accident. He loaded the body into the back of the Chevette, drove several miles to a remote spot on the Ohio River, and dumped it in. He couldn't recall exactly where he unloaded it. The police were skeptical of Whiteside's tale. After his statement, he was arrested while they checked out his story.
It just didn't pan out. It just didn't seem logical. We even had officers simulate the combat that he had described, and we found it very difficult to believe that it happened the way that he said that it did.
Unless the body turned up, the only physical evidence to prove or refute Whiteside's story was the blood-stained Chevette. The stains in the hatchback were consistent with a wounded body being stashed there. But one feature stood out. The trunk liner contained an unusual pattern, 5 lines of blood shaped like a chevron. Some blood-soaked object had been pressed against the liner, causing the marks. They were parallel, so they couldn't be impressions of fingers. The stain was notable, but meaningless, at least so far. Under the hood, investigators found a large spatter of blood. In it was a bright green fiber. No one could explain how it got there or what it meant. Inside the engine compartment appeared what looked like human tissue. It was sent off for analysis. Forensics expert Rod Englert was brought in to study the blood evidence. He found the fine mist of blood on the distributor cap wasn't consistent with a knife wound. He demonstrates.
What I'm going to do is take some blood here, and let's say that the end of this eyedropper is the end of a knife. And let's say that it has gone into my neck and I draw it back to maybe stab again, or I just pull it out very quickly. What it will cause is what's called cast off, and cast off is a resultant pattern that you see there. Now if you put these two together, as we have here, there's an enormous amount of difference between those two patterns.
A knife wound creates a cast-off that comes from one direction. But what Englert saw on the distributor cap was multi-directional.
And that only comes about through gunshot.
To Englert, the cloudy mist of blood clearly showed that Whitesides was lying. In Indiana, the pattern of bloodstains in Eric Humbert's Chevette raised doubts that he was stabbed in the throat. More doubts were raised at the forensics lab in Oregon, where the tissue sample collected from the engine was studied by Ray Grimsboe. Microscopic analysis revealed the tissue was human, but it wasn't from anyone's neck.
The arrangement of the cells, how the cells stained, told us that it was brain tissue. It was not from the skin or exfoliated tissue from some other area. This was neural tissue. We had to figure out then, how does it get out of a neck wound? And logically, it couldn't happen that way.
A closer examination of the car revealed a single bullet hole concealed at the base of the windshield wiper. 2 small fragments were recovered and sent to Grimsboe. He confirmed they were fragments of a bullet and its copper jacket. But most intriguing was the single tiny green fiber clinging to the bullet. He didn't know what to make of it. One thing was certain. The car was the scene of a shooting, not a stabbing. Whiteside's story wasn't washing. Seeking the truth, investigators went to the garage at the house where Jonathan Whitesides was living. The garage where he said his friend had accidentally stabbed himself to death. The crime scene was now 4 months old. Would anything be left? At first sight, the garage looked clean. But soon, a 9mm cartridge was found. Days later, a 9mm handgun was retrieved from Whiteside's work van. It seemed Eric Humbert had been shot. The brain tissue and the trajectory of the bullet indicated he was shot in the head. But something was missing. Something didn't seem right.
Well, we don't have a lot of blood spatter. Normally when someone gets shot in the head, we have blood and gore everywhere. In this situation, we had very little. So when we were able to identify that tissue, then as coming from brain, basically, the spatter, the bullet fragment, all tended to fit together. This person probably was shot through the head. And the question became, how'd that happen without getting it everywhere? Well, the small green fiber. I think that's when the little light went on in my head that we have a green fiber on this bullet. Bingo, that's why we don't have the blood. He had a cap on.
The weave pattern of the bloodied watch cap could also have made the chevron-shaped marks in the hatchback. The evidence so far was compelling and consistent, but was it enough to convince a jury the victim was truly Eric Humbert? All attempts to find a body met with failure.
Our body turned out to be a small piece of brain matter and some blood splatters.
The forensics team performed a DNA test on the blood. Problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. To go forward, they'd have to work backward. Blood relatives share similarities in their DNA. The forensics team counted on this to approximate Eric's genetic profile.
To identify Eric Humbert required just a paternity test, basically. We did a family history. We had his mother, his two living siblings, and his son and his wife. And so we typed them with DNA, and we took the unknown blood and the tissue from the scene, typed it.
To assure that the evidence wasn't contaminated, the DNA was tested simultaneously at 2 separate labs. The results were consistent, but investigators were still not satisfied. The forensics team needed to get DNA from both of Humbert's parents to be sure their findings were precise and irrefutable. Permission was obtained to exhume his father, who died several years earlier. DNA was extracted from his father's leg bones. The genetic codes from Humbert's father and mother were compared to the DNA from the blood in the Chevette.
We were able to show that, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this would have been consistent with a son of those two people.
Even without Eric Humbert's body, the prosecution had all it needed to convict Jonathan Whitesides. The prosecution alleged that on the last evening of Eric Humbert's life, he went to Jonathan Whitesides' house to help him fix his car. He may have suspected that his best friend was having an affair with his wife, but he couldn't have known how much his best friend wanted him out of the way. While Humbert leaned over his own car to show Whitesides how he'd made a similar repair in his Chevette, Whitesides pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot his friend execution style at point-blank range. He then loaded the body into the back of the car, disposed of it, and abandoned the vehicle. He thought that by eliminating the body, he'd eliminated all the evidence. He was wrong.
Whenever a criminal enters or leaves a crime scene, he always leaves something there. He always takes something with him. And I think that's very, very true. It's just today we are much more capable of finding those things that they take and leave than maybe we were just 10 years ago.
The jury deliberated only 45 minutes before finding Jonathan Whitesides guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. As for Eric Humbert, so far, his body hasn't been found.
Eric's mother told me after Jonathan was sentenced, she grabbed me by the arm and she said, please don't quit looking for him. And it's kind of ironic, every time we get information about a body found locally or something, it's like nobody has to say it, everybody goes, you know, like, I wonder if that's Eric. And not as of yet, it hadn't been, but you know, we're still in some way, we're still looking.
Not too long ago, when victims went missing, killers went free. Today, the rules are changing. The laws of justice have allied with the laws of science. And even if the victim can't be found, chances are the killer will be.